All right, welcome everybody. We're going to get started. Thank you for being here. This is the last Energy and Environment Forum of the spring semester. If this is your first time here, where have you been? We've had lots of really good speakers all semester, and it's been a session that's really been focused on energy and environmental justice issues in general. So we've had several people talking about that topic over the semester. Everywhere, running from economists thinking about how we make sure that electric vehicles get adopted by all segments of the population or that there aren't barriers to their adoption, to talking in general about how we reconcile climate goals with energy justice goals. So we've had lots of good speakers. If you like the things that you hear today, I would encourage you to sign up for our mailing list here at the Baker Center. If you can't figure out how to get in touch and do that, you can contact me. My name is Charles Sims. I'm the director of the Energy Environment Program here at the Baker Center. Couple of announcements. So we do have, I said it's the last Energy and Environment Forum of the semester, which is true, but we do have a couple of other events that are coming up here at the end of the semester that might get lost in your inbox just because everyone's getting so busy. Monday, April 24th. So that's not next week, that's the week after, I think. We will have Dr. Benjamin Sovacool from the Department of Earth and Environment at Boston University. He's also at the University of Sussex. He's going to be talking about negative emissions, carbon removal, solar geoengineering issues, okay? Ben is one of these really interesting guys. He has a social science background. He has a bit of an engineering background as well. But he's one of these guys that likes to combine multiple disciplines to think about these issues, so it should be a very interesting conversation. So that's April 24th, 1 to 2:30 here in the auditorium. Another talk that you might be interested in, we will have Mike Boots, who's the Executive Vice President of Breakthrough Energy. Now, Breakthrough Energy is an energy incubator, I'll say, that was originally founded by Bill Gates, okay? So this is sort of Bill Gates' sandbox as he's figuring out how we advance clean energy technology. So we will have the executive vice president of that organization here. That's gonna be more of a chat. So he and I are gonna have a bit of a chat about how we speed up climate change and clean energy transitions without causing a bunch of nasty things that we didn't mean to cause. So the title of this is around the whole notion of move fast and break things, which is the notion that you hear, right? You want to, if you're in a competitive industry, you want to move fast, break things, learn from your mistakes, and move on. We want to move fast and break things on climate change, but we want to make sure that we break the right things, right? And so we'll be talking a little bit about how we can speed up this transition without causing impacts to disenfranchised communities, how we can prevent unnecessary economic casualties, how we can prevent impacts on the environment that we may not be meaning to have. That is April 27th. That is going to be 5 to 6 p.m., also here in the auditorium, but it'll be in a more afternoon, evening-ish type of event, okay? So as I said, if you have not heard about this event before, sign up for our mailing list because we will be doing this again in the fall, okay? I think that will be the start of our 13th year doing this or something like that, which is incredible. I do want to thank, since this is the last one of the semester, I do want to thank the committee that helps us organize this, Dr. Paul Armsworth in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, Charlie Quitt at the School of Natural Resources, and Becky Jacobs in the College of Law. Those three have helped tremendously get the word out about these talks, identify speakers. These things don't just happen on their own, right? So thank you all for helping us put that together. I also want to thank Elizabeth Woody in the back for helping us put all this together, making sure that it's online, making sure that the microphones are set up. Again, these things are great, but they don't kind of make themselves happen, right? If you are watching online, welcome. We're glad you're here. We are going to have a margarita bar starting next semester in the auditorium. Am I lying? Am I telling the truth? You'll have to come and find out. But if you are online for today and you're seeing the inside of the auditorium, you can toggle your view to actually see the PowerPoint presentation from the speaker today. So if you're sitting in the auditorium and you're thinking, I can't see what he's talking about, you should be able to toggle the view on your mobile device to figure out how to switch over and look at the PowerPoint presentations. You'll also see a link at the bottom of the page that you're looking at that will send you to a web page where you can enter questions for the speaker. So we want to get some interactions from the folks online. If you have a question, post it there, and then we'll collect all those questions and field them at the end of the talk. Okay. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nikki Luke from the College of Geography to introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you, Charles. I think we're getting a PowerPoint back up. But yeah, I'm Nikki Luke in the Department of Geography. And I am excited to introduce Dr. Andrew Curley and grateful to him for taking the time to be here with us. Dr. Curley completed his PhD at Cornell and a postdoc at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, working there as an assistant professor before moving to the University of Arizona in 2020, where he is an assistant professor in the School of Geography, Development, and Environment. Dr. Curley is Dene and a member of the Navajo Nation, and his research investigates the everyday incorporation of Indigenous nations into colonial economies, how Indigenous nations continue to thrive and define resources, development, and infrastructure, and the political work of decolonization. He's a leading scholar within geography of energy, decolonization, and Indigenous geographies. And his work has been published also in really prominent geography and social science journals, including the Annals of the American Association of Geographers, Antipode, Environment and Planning D, Anthropological Quarterly, Geoforum, and Environment and Society. And that's just a few of the places where his work is published. So please, if you're not familiar with it, I'd encourage you to go check it out. And he'll be speaking with us today about his brand new book that I think was just released this month, which is really exciting. I have a copy of it here, if I can multitask holding multiple things. So please check it out. Carbon Sovereignty, Coal Development, and Energy Transition in the Navajo Nation, published by the University of Arizona Press. He's also presented on his research in the Navajo Generating Station to the House Committee on Natural Resources, which might be of interest to folks in the public policy program here. His work has been funded by the Werner Gren Foundation, and he's currently funded through the Sloan Foundation as part of a research team trying to understand the social implications of energy transition and resource development for energy-rich tribal communities. So if you'll join me in welcoming Dr. Curley.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the sponsors of this presentation and the invitation to give a presentation on some of my research here at the University of Tennessee. It's really nice to get to know a new place. Like was just said, I am going to be talking a lot about this book that was just published through the University of Arizona Press. And I'm going to focus on one chapter on that, and that's the perspective of coal workers, so that you can get a sense. So this is the larger text, and some of it is about history and the history of the Navajo Nation in particular, and thinking about what are the roles of the federal government with tribes. And so there's some other issues that I take on, but I think for the interest of this audience, I really wanted to focus on how Dene or Navajo coal workers were impacted by the transition out of coal that is ongoing throughout the U.S., but in particular in Indian country. So as I was preparing for this presentation, I was going through the Energy Information Agency and generating some new up-to-date information on what's going on, what is the state. First, I wanted to give you a sense of the methodology. How did I approach this research, and what kinds of information am I getting? What is the basis of my data? As an ethnographic project, I was basically doing field work, doing participant observation for approximately 2 years, during which time I observed events, and a lot of the information is about the Navajo Nation's negotiation with the utility, the Salt River Project, over the proposed continuation of the Navajo Generating Station, one of the largest coal-fired power plants in the U.S. and in that region, and the biggest carbon emitter in Indian country at that point. and also the continuation of the Kayenta mine, a mine that at its peak employed 300 coal workers and was a vital economic engine for that part of the reservation, just south of Monument Valley, if any of you are familiar with where that area is. And so during the course of that research, I was able to interview 42 people, which doesn't seem like a lot compared when you're doing some other when you're looking at other qualitative research projects. But at this particular point in time, during the course of the coal negotiations, it was really hard to recruit people to want to talk about the importance of the industry for them. And there was some hesitancy to talk to somebody like me in academia who was, who might be perceived as a threat to their work. And so, might be seen as somebody who's working with environmental groups directly and trying to undermine their livelihood. So it was really a struggle, quite honestly, to get the perspective of the coal workers. So that's something but that was my main aim. That was what I was really trying to get at. But nevertheless, I did interview environmental organizers and activists and tribal officials, trying to triangulate perspectives and show that there's a complicated picture of energy and energy transition in Indian country among tribal actors. So sometimes we resort to stereotypes, sometimes racist stereotypes that show Indian people as having one kind of vantage point around these things. And what I wanted to show in this research and in the texts, like the article in the book that was published, is that there's actually a complicated understanding of these questions, especially when there's a lived experience with coal among tribal actors, either tribal officials or coal workers. In other words, if your livelihood depends on it, you're going to have a certain kind of politics around coal that might be different from environmental activists and organizers. And so I wanted to highlight that perspective and get a sense of how they were thinking about not only their work, but some of these looming and larger environmental questions that environmental activists actually work on all the time. So that was the origin of the project and the type of work I was doing. And I also tried to historicize this question of coal and development in the reservation and looking at where did it come from and how did we end up having this industry in the first place. And in order to do that, I had to go to some archives in Arizona. Carl Hayden papers. Carl Hayden is, I guess, like your Baker. He's a longtime senator in Arizona who was instrumental in passing a lot of infrastructure projects, especially water infrastructure projects for the state. And then Stuart Udall, who was a former congressman and the Secretary of Interior, who was really instrumental in getting the Navajo generating station established in the first place. So a lot of the origin points of this project I wanted to get at by looking at these older materials. So that's the approach. So like I said, I went to look at some of the updated information on energy in Indian country, on reservations, coming out of the the energy, it could be called, the Energy Information Agency, data maintained by the federal government. And this is, they have an atlas that you can create. It's a separate website even from their website. And I find it really useful. So if you ever want to play around with these things, and maybe you already have, but you can put 2 layers. You can add layers and subtract layers. So I did this based on oil and gas, where are known oil and gas fields, and then looking at reservations or tribal reservations, large land-based tribes. Many of these are located in the western states. So you can see this is the Navajo Nation here in this purple area in Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. And you can see where there's some oil and gas areas. And there's a lot of that kind of drilling and activity. With coal, now this is an older map. There's a newer one that's available, but it actually hides some of the information. So sometimes maps can be deceptive. Maybe geographers will tell you all the time maps can be deceptive. And they don't give you kind of the historical, complicated, and social information that feeds into the experience of these things, of mines and power plants, that a simple map just kind shows you dots on in an area. So like I made this in probably 2014, 2015, excuse me. And at that time, the Navajo generating station, which is this little dot here with the triangle in it, was still in operation and still existing. And then the Kayenta mine, which is right here, was still around. If you generate this map today, these things are gone, they're disappeared. And so that whole legacy is not even represented right on the map. So that's what I'm getting at. An interesting picture, again, debunking some of the stereotypes of Indian energy experience, is to look at the uneven effects of different kinds of energy on reservations. So a lot of you might be familiar with the protests around the Dakota Access Pipeline, the attempt to stop a oil pipeline going north of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe near the Missouri River, and a lot of the protests that was generated around that. Well, that has to do with these oil and gas boom that's going on, especially in the Bakken Shale. And as you can see, so this table ends at 2014. It's almost a decade old, the information. But you can see during that time, the percentage of oil that's being done, that's being produced on reservation land, the U.S. percentage, you can understand, fossil fuel sales production on Indian lands has increased a lot from at that point 0.5 to almost 2%. And then coal, on the other hand, had a high of 3% of U.S. total down to 1.9 and even less today. So, this table, I keep going back to this website, the EIA website, to see if they've updated it. They haven't. It just ends at 2014. So I kind of looked through where they get their stuff, which is through the natural resources revenue data, and was looking at what are the updated information. And this is for coal alone, and you can see how that has really collapsed in the last few years from 2005 to 2020. And on Indian land, it's just gone downhill. And there's no coal produced on Navajo Nation or in many other reservations. So the whole industry's gone. So we're talking about we're really talking about an obituary of an industry here. So that's what my work is on. It's a long obituary, which is kind of funny because we're in like a big sarcophagus, as what we're talking about, like with the center of this. Anyway, well, I was thinking there was going to be a sarcophagus. It's another kind of conversation we can have. Maybe not for this presentation. So what I wanted to go over, that what leads to these uneven effects and what is leading to energy development in Indian country in the first place is a combination of policy and development, federal Indian policy and development policy for reservations. So these things are mirrored off of each other. And when you do an American Indian Studies class or Native American Studies class, you will you'll learn the history of federal Indian policy. Or if you go to a law school and and study federal Indian law, you'll learn about these major acts or executive orders in this case. But what is not really spelled out, sometimes implied, are what is the development aim and objective of this policy? What were they trying to do in Indian country? And so I tried to spell that out in this table. So in 1887, the federal government, Congress actually passed the General Allotment Act to try to allot surplus Indian lands, or to allot reservation lands to individual heads of household. So this was instituting a kind of decentering kinship and community-based identities to nuclear families and around patriarchy, around a male head of household, and denying matrilineal systems where they existed. So it was a very legislated social approach to social. It was a social engineering project, basically, and the whole idea was on assimilating and focusing on individuals. And so a lot of the allotments were given to families instead of nations, And those families could negotiate with outside oil companies during this time for access to the subterranean resources. And that led to a lot of mismanagement of leasing and lease agreements, not because the individuals were mismanaging it, but because even though these lands were allotted, the federal government still maintained control over those lands under this doctrine of trust responsibility, going back 100 years before that into 1830s Supreme Court decisions about the nature of Indian land, what is its status in the United States, and so the Secretary of Interior, the Bureau of Indian, well, at that time, the Bureau of Indian Affairs would oversee these leases and negotiate on behalf of tribal members, and often in ways that were beneficial to the companies wanting to access oil and get at the oil under Indian land, rather than the peoples whose lands were being leased. And you'll probably so I'm kind of giving you a vague picture, but there's going to be a movie coming out by Martin Scorsese about what is it called, Flower of the Killer Moon or something like that, about the Osage killings, and they'll go more into detail about that, especially with Osage, whose identities were literally defined by mineral rights. So that was a federal policy that was going on at that time, and it was very bad. It led to a lot of land loss and actual murder in the case of the Osage. So when you get to the point of the 1930s, after economic collapse, a change in administration, there's also something called the Merriam Report that was looking at the status, trying to assess what have been, if any of these policies have been beneficial for tribes, and that Merriam Report found that in fact, that it was leading to further impoverishment. It was actually having the opposite of its intended effect, and so they wanted to redo Indian policy. And the then Commissioner of Indian Affairs, John Collier, convinced the Congress to pass the Indian Reorganization Act, consolidated authority into tribal governments around councils. Or now many of those councils have become, like in the case of the Navajo Nation, 3-branch governments. They've evolved over time, but around a central authority who could negotiate on behalf of the community with outside companies that were trying to access mineral rights or oil or coal or other kinds of things within Indian land. So like we're talking about the BHPs, the Billotins. That earlier it was like Standard Oil, and then it became some of these other major transnational corporations. So these twin acts, the Indian Reorganization Act, the Indian Mineral Leasing Act, pretty much created the framework around which mining and leasing could happen in Indian country. And everything since then, what happened to the pointer? Everything since then is just an expansion of those authorities. So this morning, in preparation for this presentation, I was listening to the passage of this in 2017. And what was it doing actually? It was just expanding a lot of the existing authorities, trying to reduce the role of the Secretary of Interior on day-to-day decisions on leasing in Indian country. And it had a lot of tribal support from various nations that are reliant on oil, coal, or gas extraction within their lands, like Unitah and Utah, the Navajo Nation, Southern Ute. There's a lot of Western tribes whose lands have these resources, who have been developing them for a long time, that we're trying to amend federal law to make it easier for them to lease it on their own. So that's basically what has been happening over the course of the last 100 years. Now, to get a sense of how this has impacted the Navajo Nation, well, here's a map, more detailed about what that energy landscape looks like within the communities where I work. And so this was a Black Mesa mine and the Kayenta mine, the two mine sites where I was doing my field work. I didn't actually work or do field work there. I was living in Kayenta and trying to interview workers at this mine site, getting a sense of what they were thinking about their work and their industry. And then that's the Navajo Generating Station that was featured on the first slide. That was the main consumer, the only consumer of this coal, and that's a rail line that connected them. And now there's a couple of other mines in the area. So we historically had 4 mines, one to the McKinley mine 3, and the Navajo mine 4. And these are large-scale strip mining that was done to bring coal either to this Choya generating station or the Four Corners generating station that's been around since 1964, and the San Juan generating station, which has since closed. So all of these are, showing the expansion of coal in the Navajo Nation. And when these two mines closed and this mine closed, that's led to a lot of that decline that you saw in the earlier chart. The rapid decline of coal mining in Indian country. This Navajo Nation tends to overrepresent a lot of Indian country. We're the largest land-based tribe and the second largest population of tribal members. So anything that happens in Navajo disproportionately impacts what's going on throughout all of Indian country. What happened to that slide? It got lost in translation. I made this on Keynote. Have any of you used that? And then I exported it. So I'm going to just say this is colonialism. That's why it's white. It's my colonial slide. Yeah. Give you a sense of the impact of these revenues. So when I was doing my research, when I was looking at this issue of coal and coal mining in the Navajo Nation, coal accounted for 24% of non-federal revenues. And what that means is there are certain monies that come into tribal communities that are already earmarked, like you can only spend it on certain things, and they just fund those things. Now, discretionary money, things that you could, like if you want to expand social services in a certain area, or if you want to fix roads that other entities are not taking care of, that has to come from somewhere else, and that's where all of this other money is coming from. And so it's either sales taxes, so we don't have income taxes, so sales taxes, private land that we lease out to ranchers outside of the reservation, and the coal and oil and gas account for the other half. So that becomes a big part of the every year operational budget of the Navajo Nation. And when you have 24% of your discretionary funding suddenly collapse, then that causes all sorts of problems, including laying off workers, ending tribal scholarships. There's all sorts of secondary effects that happen when you lose a big source of revenue like that for the tribal government. So I just added this in this morning while I was tweaking the presentation. This was a way. This is another way to say that same, to show that same. So this is one way of presenting that information, and here's another way of presenting that information. This was our cartoonist for the Navajo Times. It's our tribal paper, A. Hastine, and this was done 4 years later, at a time when then Speaker Lorenzo Bates was really trying to keep the coal industry going in the reservation through either creating a coal company called Navajo Transitional Energy Company and trying to buy the mine, trying to buy the power plant before it closed. There's all sorts of desperate acts that the tribe was trying to do. And the cartoonist was characterizing it like this, here's this guy, he's trying to maintain revenues from coal lease and jobs, right? And those are the two things that I found in my research. Those are the main those are the main reasons why the tribal government and and coal workers were really trying to keep this industry going, is for these two things. And then here's the coal industry represented as a dinosaur with burning off coal emissions. This was actually, what's the date today? This was done on this date 5 years ago. Is that right? Or 6 years ago? 6 years ago. Math. I'm not an engineer, so I can't do math. So that's giving you a different kind of take on that picture. Okay, so the questions I had when I went into this project was, why does the Navajo Nation continue to participate in the coal industry despite some of the challenges that the coal industry faces, and despite the environmental concerns that environmental activists are raising? And when I went to, this is a picture I took inside of the Kayenta chapter house while they were debating some of these issues for the continuation of the mine and the lease, or this is some of the infrastructure that was left behind from the Black Mesa mine. It was a coal slurry that was moving coal with water 273 miles from this mine site to Laughlin, Nevada, to be burned. or, this was the image of the McKinley mine before it closed down when it was reporting the last time it had an accident. All of these events and what was going on the land had to do with people's jobs, people's ability to maintain themselves and maintain kin relations and have employment. So a lot of people had family members who worked in the industry. A lot of people had knew that those people who had jobs at the coal mine would go into town and spend money, and they depended on that kind of money to continue to circulate in the community. So this was a big driver. This was a big reason why many of the community members and the coal workers were wanting the Navajo Nation to renew leases and renew its contracts with the utility, despite the looming threats. And so, what really encapsulated this thinking was this one interview I had with a Kayenta mine worker who had been working in the industry for at that time about 40 years, and his dad was a former council delegate that went back to the 1940s, and he knew the region, for like the last 100 years, and knew everything that was going on in the area, and then he ended up working at the Kayenta mine and being a main union organizer and leader there. But anyway, the quote says, "Already they are prejudiced because we are practicing," and in this case he was referring to the Navajo Nation Council, saying that they're not going to renew it because they don't like us. He's saying they were prejudiced against us because we're doing what our great-grandmas and great-grandpas said, ego. It's going to be up to you to be something. We are not practicing what those councilmen over there are doing, which is sitting around and going to bars. No, we are doing what we were told, ego. Get up in the morning, make some money, good things will come to you. We get up early in the morning and come back, and we brought just a little bit of progress. And so in hearing this testimony and hearing what this guy was saying, this coal worker, what I realized is that they're coming at this question differently from tribal officials, like what represented in this image here, of especially looking at revenues, especially looking at this coal revenue. What they're looking at is progress. They're looking at doing what their grandmas and grandpas told them. So they're talking about an older ethic, some sort of older work ethic that is somehow fulfilled by the kind of labor they're doing at the coal mine. So I thought it was important to investigate that, to really get at a sense of why these workers find this kind of labor meaningful. Meaningful is an important thing here. And that's the whole basis of social science, is really trying to get a sense of not only social change, but social meaning. Not what is happening, but why the people interpret what is happening the way they do. And I couldn't have said that more confusingly. But so the way I interpreted it, going back to some of the early anthropology and sociology in the Navajo Nation, is to think about this ethic of work that was expressed in this quote as something that is based on a land work ethic that comes from our tradition of herding sheep and doing small-scale agriculture, that when you're living in this part of the world, you have to work hard to maintain yourself, right? That's what's said here. We are doing what we were told, ego. Get up in the morning, make some money, good things will happen for you. In a herding culture, you have to get up really early, even before the sun comes up. Let sheep out, let them graze before it gets too hot. Otherwise, they're not going to get enough food, and they're going to be malnourished. And so there's a lot of emphasis on time, on getting up, on being industrious with the daylight that you have, and then of course going to bed early and being ready for the next day. That is a normal working culture within the reservation. It's a labor ethic that predates wage labor, right? It's a subsistence ethic, is how I argue it in another paper. And what I say is, unlike what maybe some sociologists would say in the 19th century, like Durkheim or Weber or even Marx, talking about the alienation of wage labor, how this has really transformed our society to being so distant from the past. I think in the case of the Navajo Nation, we've really translated those values into regimes of wage labor. And it's not an exacting translation, but it's something where there is a resonance. So even though you're literally destroying the land to maintain yourself on the land, you're still fulfilling a social meaning, which is why it continues to have importance and resonance, and why, despite the obvious contradictions of working on land that you want to save, you're still finding a justification for it. So that's what's the value of this kind of social science work, is to think about why is it people are doing things beyond simplistic understandings. And I think that if you look at the history of these people, they're coming at a point where they're not going out into, they started coal work, and I get a history by interviewing them. When did you start working in the industry? What were you doing before that? They graduate from high school, they maybe came back from boarding school, maybe their father or grandfather worked in the uranium industry before coal. So they have a history of mine work, even if it's in a totally different kind of mining in that area. And so they're learning it from their family, or they're learning it, or it's an opportunity presented to them as soon as they graduate, or when they come back at this time in the 70s from Vietnam War. Then that's the kind of opportunities they have. They're not going to college. They're not going off into other industries. So it's a kind of education that you can get, an enhancement of labor, a skilling of labor that was still, you could still do in an industry like coal work at that time, that a lot of people took advantage of. And those are transferable skills. So if you start learning how to drive a truck in a coal mine, like a big haulage truck, you can do that somewhere else. If you learn how to be a welder, you can do that somewhere else, or electrician. You can learn skills in these industries that you can also you can apply elsewhere. So they saw all of this as a kind of a valuable, and it went into their identity, especially emergent ideas of masculinity, which is problematic for a lot of reasons, and it goes back to that enforced patriarchy that was going to the 1887 Allotment Act, or a lot of church groups going into the reservation and trying to missionize and convert people and instill a sense of patriarchy. So there's a history to evolving ideas of masculinity, but the way that coal was presented definitely was presented in a gendered way, to the degree where there was very few women working in these industries. There were some, and often they were tokenized, and they were used as kind of examples of women in this coal field industry, but they were not the ones directly benefiting from this kind of labor. So, what are some of the costs and the legacies of coal since its collapse? Like I said, it's an obituary of an industry. Well, we've lost, since its collapse, because of the transition out of coal in the last few years, approximately 440 jobs historically. Now, that ebbed and flowed depending on, over the years, the explanation for the differences in labor here has to do with the slow closure of these places. So one unit would shut down. With a utility, with a power plant like Navajo Generating Station, and the way it came into formation, there were multiple utility owners. So the Salt River was a majority owner. Salt River a project, a utility that serves Phoenix. But you also had Nevada Electric and Arizona Power Service and LA Water and Power. They were all minority owners of this utility. They had different states and different laws that they were following, and so LA Water and Power in Nevada decided to close down, to sell off their ownership and basically close down their demand. And then that meant that they were producing less coal, producing less energy, consuming less coal, needing less workers. And so eventually, that had a slow decline before everything shut down in 2018 and 2017 era. And then it was eventually demolished in 2021. Some of the environmental costs are the amount of water that's used in this industry. It requires a lot of water, and all that water is coming from aquifer water. We don't have access to the Colorado River in the Navajo Nation. We have to get all of our water from aquifers that we have authority over. And a lot of that was lost in that coal slurry that operated from 1971 until 2006, that was basically using about 3 million gallons of water a day to move that coal. And this was arguably potable water, drinkable water that you could consume, but it was used to move coal to save money. And that was the only rationale, really, for using water to move coal, because it was a long distance between the mine site and where it was being produced for energy. And they didn't want to build rail, which was a conventional way to move coal. They wanted to, this was Southern California Edison, the utility that owned the Laughlin, Nevada power plant. They wanted to save money on that. So they insisted in contract in 1967 on a coal slurry. Now, another thing that is a casualty of this kind of work is the land. So even though like you have this reservation land, and you go back to the map, I don't want to go all the way back, but if you go back to that map in the beginning, you'll see that okay, there's the reservation in these two little triangles, like a circle and a triangle and a triangle, but it's not speaking to the fact that after 40 years of strip coal mining, a lot of this land is toxic. You can't really use it for growing food or herding sheep. So it's just sitting there, fallow. In fact, it has to be reclaimed according to law. And we were talking about that earlier in the lunch about like how apparently some coal companies declare bankruptcy to get out of the responsibility of reclamation, which I know less about. I just know that Peabody Coal, it was called the Peabody Western Coal Company, the one that was probably a subsidiary of Peabody Energy. It is a subsidiary of Peabody Energy, declared bankruptcy right, before they shut down the Kayenta mine. And maybe it had to do with the Black Mesa mine closing in 2006. I don't know what their decision making was about, but that fact correlates with some of these other narratives that are happening around. But that's a lot of acres that are still like you can't use because of coal mining. And there's some people that organize around that want to bring that land back. These are historic lands that their families had for many years. And there's a group called Black Mesa United. They go to some of these council meetings, they go to the tribal government, they're like, we want to have access to that land. They can't have access to that land. And that's still being maintained by Peabody Coal. There's a few workers that have been retained to try to help with that restoration. But the traditional homelands of the peoples who were on that still are denied. So there is like internally within the reservation, there's a loss of land, even if you don't see it on a map. Now, some of the counter narratives, the way that environmental organizers were presenting this problem looked a lot different than the picture I just showed you. So I was talking about revenues and jobs, and environmental organizers were really attuned to this idea of environmental sustainability and concerned about the question of greenhouse gases and how much carbon was being released into the atmosphere and causing climate change, was contributing to climate change. So their perspective was we need to transition out of some of these fossil fuel industries. These things are colonial. They really highlighted the colonial nature of tribal governments and the consolidation of political power coming out of the federal government, that there's a politics of recognition in the way that tribes are understood from environmental groups. And these are Navajo environmental groups or Dene environmental groups, not non-native environmental groups, which have different kinds of narratives. So they're really attuned to the cultural and especially the cultural significance of these places, and trying to promote alternative energies, especially that are consistent with the local understandings of the land, by Dene people or Hopi people or Paiute or any of the other nations in the area. So I found that this mural that was painted at the same time that I was observing these conversations about coal on the reservation being done, like the coal lease being talked about in the tribal council, and then the coal workers petitioning the council to continue to extend that lease, that the environmental groups were constructing a different narrative, and it's representing this mural. So this mural was painted in downtown Phoenix which is interesting, choice of a place to give this message, to critique that whole coal industry. So so the places that I just showed you, like I showed you a picture of that slurry, that Black Mesa mine. This is a mural depicting that same slurry, and it's showing you tapping into the aquifer, transferring coal over here to NGS, which was a picture on the first slide, and then moving water. So they're connecting water and energy here in this mural to Phoenix. They're putting things into a spatial relation in this mural that are giving you a social political critique of water and energy in the Southwest. So like everything I'm saying pretty much in the last 40 minutes could be summarized on this half of the mural. So, you could have just, I could have just sent you this mural and then saved you all a lot of trouble. But yeah, but what's interesting here is, so this is Phoenix, and it's on one side of our it's called Nadle Atsa, I think, Changing Woman, and she has a first man basket here, which is, so this is an intertribal message about like rooting people in place, like the emergence of both of these nations, Tohono, which are based in southern Arizona, and Navajo in northern Arizona. And it's the center of the mural, like, so it's centering this as the basis of where you get your ideals for living on the earth. And so on the left-hand side, on the negative space, is where you have this critique of the status quo. And then this is the aspirational side on the white side, where there's corn pollen being I can't think of a better word, but blessed. And you have alternative to like golf courses, you have more subsistence agriculture, squash, pumpkin, and traditional corn, not like the conventional monoculture corn that you get, or corn that you feed to other animals, but like stuff that was developed in the region, and then the sheep like we had before, from the traditional sheep herding. And then they're using these alternative energy technology. They're saying like, oh, we need solar and wind. So they're saying like, oh, we can have modern forms of energy, but that are consistent with these values. Now, when I wrote a paper about this and like explains this in a journal article, I had a reviewer say, oh, well, isn't there like contradiction in all this? Because like these things aren't necessarily sustainable, and like, there's problems with wind, there's problems with solar. True. It's not to like really like fixate on the contradictions. It's just to say this is how these two things are being presented, right? This is an ideology in formation. This is a counter narrative to what has been the coal narrative for the last 40, 50 years within the reservation. Now, whether it's successful and whether it's absent of contradictions, well, we know it's not, and it has yet to be successful, but that's just a way that people are responding to the collapse of coal, is to be thinking about all their forms of energy. And my own critique is like, well, why do we even need to be in energy anymore? But for whatever reason, people still talk about energy as a source of jobs in the reservation. So here is a list of energy counter proposals that have been done over the last 20 years. While coal hasn't been in decline, there's been these groups, the Just Transition Coalition. When they were responding to the closure of Black Mesa mine in 2006, they proposed a solar field on Black Mesa. Some of these reclaimed lands that are like, or some of these lands that are under a reclamation by Peabody, they were like, why don't we just put solar on there? It's not possible because we have to allow Peabody they still have a lease on that land. I've actually gone to our like minerals office and said, hey, is this a possibility? And they said, no, go according to the law. It's still under the jurisdiction of Peabody Coal, and they have obligations for what they have to do to that land before they leave. Alternative, there was a report by the environmental group Dinecare in 2008 to really emphasize wind technology and the job and revenue potential of wind. That of course is always debatable, but that's something that they were proposing. And then in 2009, I witnessed a coalition of environmental groups get Navajo Nation to pass agreed jobs law to really actually for the first time, tried to fund small-scale energy development, not even energy development, something called green jobs, like carbon-neutral jobs within the reservation, which included sheep herding, weavers co-op, or small-scale wind and solar. That has completely failed for a lot of reasons, but this was something that was attempted and even passed by the Navajo Nation Council. So we see there's gestures to try to do this, to move out of coal and move out of fossil fuels. They're not really successful, except for the 2017 Kayenta solar mine, which is near the site of the Kayenta mine that went down in the same year, pretty much, and owned by the same utility. So there's a contradiction in that, right? Like the utility is still replicating its power inequality in the reservation, even if it's doing a new kind of energy technology. So this solar field opened up in 2017. It generates much less energy than the power plant, and it is almost like a symbolic project more than an actual thing that employs people, or it definitely doesn't employ people, like maybe 2 people work there, and doesn't generate the same amount of revenues as coal does, but it's there as like an alternative energy. So it's like countering the kind of energy you're getting, even if it's not replicating the jobs or the revenues. To conclude, this idea of Ahwachit ego that the co-worker said at the beginning, that I think was that had contained the social meaning for the workers in their industriousness and working with coal, it's changing again. It's moving away from the way that particular person understood it to thinking about other things like solar and wind, and a way to say we can be independent of some of these past relations that have really hamstrung us, that had really made it difficult for us to exercise a degree of sovereignty and self-determination, that we were at the whims of the coal company or the utility in the case of Salt River Project. So that's something. So I was talking to some of the students before the presentation about the meaning of this word, and actually one of the students was saying that they actually looked at the Navajo dictionary and couldn't find this word, Ahwachit ego, and where did this come from? And I was saying, oh, actually, it's a political term. It's like a political concept in the Navajo Nation that has shifting meaning. Like I was using the example of democracy. Like democracy, you can define it literally and just say it's this thing, but there's always like political groups that are trying to define it in a certain way. They're like, democracy is this. Democracy means when people get when people get their will satisfied, or some people may say, oh, it's a majority of people, or it's like when the most marginalized people get something. Everybody has a different definition of democracy. It's the same way with Ahwachit ego. It's a political concept that different groups will utilize to try to ground their actions in older philosophies and ideas that are Dene. And so this idea of doing it for yourself and self-determination that's embodied in this phrase is being redeployed and redefined in different kinds of energy technology. So again, moving out of not only from subsistence labor into wage labor, but also into a different kind of energy sector. Whether or not that's successful is yet to be seen, but I'm just showing you the social landscape on the field, on the ground. Let's see, I think that's it. That's the end of my conversation. Do I have it? Yep. So I went a little long, sorry. I tried to.
No, you're fine.
Okay, good.
We got time for questions, and I'll start us off. So you said this is that this is a bit of an obituary, and we're sort of going to the same funeral in this region. There's lots of coal in this area. We're also kind of grappling with these questions about transitioning away and things. And the dominant argument that you often hear from folks in the region is that kind of just similar to the ones you described, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering how much that transitions through from the Appalachian experience to the experience in the Navajo Nation, where you have, on the one hand, people are saying, yeah, coal was dirty and it polluted our rivers and things, but we learned a lot and we had jobs and it supported our livelihoods and all this. To those people who were like, no, coal has been a thorn in our side this whole time. We would have been better off as we not had it. We think of the resources as a curse because without those resources, we probably would have evolved into some other non-energy dependent economy, right? And so is that the similar type of, it sounds like that's the similar type of conversation that's going on there. And it just strikes me as fascinating that we don't link those two things up, that these kind of same conversations that are often just perpetuated in Appalachia as being Appalachia's problem, they're going on elsewhere. So if you could just...
Oh yeah, there's a lot of linkages. And we're not, like you're saying, like I don't, academically, we don't really make those connections, but the mine workers do. So they, like the UMWA was the United Mine Workers America was a union representing workers at the two mines that I talked about, and they link up with a larger national organization, which I think is based in West Virginia. Is that right? Charleston? Yeah. So sometimes like you'll get people from Ohio or Kentucky coming out to Arizona saying, you know, this is what coal does for us. So they're already doing that. And now we're kind of doing that. What you said is exactly, you know, parallel to some of the conversations I've had. I didn't give the quote here in this presentation, but I talked to a Dene environmental organizer who gave that same hypothetical. If we didn't go into coal mining, what might have been the possibilities? What might we have done? What could our nation have been without it? And I was thinking about that. And often, like, I think when I started my research, I think I was thinking about it like that, like, oh, this kind of resource curse approach. But then, you know, I read Timothy Mitchell's book, and I was also like seeing how coal did a lot of stuff on the reservation, including providing scholarships or funding the tribal college. And it was like, wow, it does a lot of state building. It was like, especially for the Navajo Nation, maybe it's a little bit different in Appalachia, but like, especially for the Navajo Nation, like in the era of self-determination, from 1975 till about 2005, it provided a lot of resources for the tribe that were like, we're going to build new tribal complexes, we're going to fund students, we're going to build new roads. You know, it allowed a kind of aspiration for a nation to be something that was to move outside of kind of the colonial paternalism of the BIA that preceded 1975, even going back to in the 1950s when they were terminating tribes, when they were just ending tribal recognition for some tribes and threatening to move whole communities outside of reservations into cities. So it was seen as a resource to maintain institutions and to build on new institutions. And I didn't talk about it in this presentation, but in the 1970s, there was a number of large land-based tribes and tribes that depended a lot on coal or oil that came together and formed the Council of Energy-Rich Tribes, or CERT. And they were taking their model off of OPEC. They were like, look at what OPEC was able to do. You know, if they can control the resources that the Western nations are consuming, they can get more political leverage. So they're like, we can increase our political leverage if we somehow come together and control our resources. Now, CERT eventually became more of a lobbying group for fossil fuel. Like eventually it just evolved into a lobbying to say we want federal government to like maintain pro-coal policies. And then eventually it just collapsed altogether and is no longer around. But that was like in the 70s and 80s, that's what it was all about, was about trying to build that up. And so my perspective from this book is to think about it as a kind of a state building time. And that's where that carbon sovereignty title comes from. It's like taking off of Mitchell's idea, inverting the resource curse to say, oh, all of this was made possible by these resources. And then to think about how sovereignty was redefined from 75 until the collapse of coal, and then how it's being redefined again against this idea of carbon as a greenhouse gas by environmental organizers. So that's the different direction I took with it. And I build my work off of some of the other one ethnography in particular that worked on Appalachia, which was by Rebecca Scott. It's called Removing Mountains. And like I saw a lot of parallels in her ethnography there in West Virginia and what I was seeing on the Navajo Nation. There's big differences in terms of the politics. West Virginia has a lot more power than the Navajo Nation. Has like 2 senators and I don't know how many congressmen. We have 0. We have to rely on the states, and often they're adversarial to tribal interests. So there's a big political difference between states or these kind of communities and the kind of political leverage coal communities that Appalachia have vis-a-vis tribal communities. But, in terms of like the way the workers defined their labor, it seemed to have a lot of similarities to the way the workers define their labor in the Navajo Nation. So that's my answer to that question. Yeah. Sorry, I'm not doing who wants to call it you? Anyway, go ahead. Yeah, thank you. Okay, yeah, appreciate it.
I'm holding the microphone, Andrew.
This is easy. Yeah. That's what I saw.
So thank you, Andrew. I wanted to go back in your answer there. You mentioned the United Mine Workers, and in the article you gave us to read, that was one where I found it super interesting, and it really came to a completely raw. But you talked about the sort of the shifting receptivity to trade unions inside different groups within Navajo Nation in there. But it was sort of a more historical perspective on it. I wondered where that stood now. As there's a transition away from coal happening, is there also a transition away from sort of receptivity to trade unionism, or have they sort of propagated through other aspects of Navajo Nation?
The unions were pretty much limited to that industry, to the coal work, and I think there have been attempts to try to unionize different sectors of Navajo, either teachers or even tribal or government officials, but it's not really picked up in the same way that the United Mine Workers had. I just think they had for whatever reason, a stronger organization, and they were able to effectively unionize the Navajo Nation. But other unions haven't been able to organize anybody in that area. So yeah, there's some outside like electrical union in some of the border towns like Farmington and Page, but in the actual reservation that was those were the 2 main ones. Yeah.
On the mural slide, yeah. On the far right, there's some script, and
I don't know. Oh, that's that's controversial script. Yeah, I think it says "Water is life." I think that was a graffiti artist from I forget what nation he was from, but yeah, he just kind of added it in there. Some of the artists were really not about. I don't know. It wasn't as consistent with the rest of the mural. There's, how artists are. Sometimes they fight with each other. That's what happened with that script.
I looked in the United Mine Workers America Triangle, Virginia. Although there is a big office in Charleston, West Virginia.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that.
The other thing that I was curious about was when I saw the natural gas went down along with coal, and I thought with the fracking revolution, I suspected it would go up.
Yeah, same. Yeah, I don't know. I can't explain that. Yeah. That is interesting, though. Yeah. It needs explaining. Yeah, maybe somebody here can do that as a research project.
So I was curious, like you talked about like attaching like cultural identity to like one specific industry, and that was like we've talked about, that was something that was really common in this area. Yeah. And the way that like the coal industry capitalized on that was through like the organization, the Friends of Coal, started by the West Virginia Coal Association. I was just curious if that was something, like if there was something similar, or if FOC had any presence down there, and if like maybe they kind of did a similar thing.
No, I don't. They didn't have. There was no like formal organization like that. It was just mainly the union. But I think they just had such a control of the political institutions. Maybe they didn't feel like there needed to be any kind of outside organizing. I know, like, so I interviewed family members, and they just said what they felt, but they weren't part of any kind of like civil organization. And a lot of like the tribal lawmakers, like at the time in 2012, 2013, when a lot of these conversations were happening, the speaker of the Navajo Nation had used to work for Peabody. And some, a lot of the people who were in formal leadership had actually worked at the mine site or had worked in some capacity, either as workers or salaried employees, which are very different kinds of jobs, And so, but the closest thing I can say is one time I was outside of of a community meeting in this place called Pinon. That's where my wife's from, actually, Pinon, Arizona. And it's like on Black Mesa, but a little bit away from the coal mines. And there was this was the council's natural resource committee meeting. And then, so there was 4 council delegates, and they were hearing about what was going to happen to the former Black Mesa site. And there was these representatives from this group called Black Mesa United. Now they're not like that same group. They're very different. They're a family. They're people who are related to families who were pushed off of the lease lands. They were given new housing, and their housing was funded by the coal company. So like the houses were built around Kayenta, and then they lived there, but they didn't have access to their former lands because they were moved off. And so then they organized and said, now that this is closing, we want to get back at this land. So they called themselves Black Mesa United. They were there. There was Black Mesa Water Coalition, which is an environmental group. And then there was Peabody Coal, only non-native guy there, white guy. So it was like all Navajo people and then this white guy, and that's Peabody Coal. And and so this guy, so I was talking to this guy from Black Mesa United, and outside of the chapter house, and then the Peabody Coal guy comes out, and he starts interpreting his narrative for me. And he starts saying, yeah, and he's like asking him questions on my behalf. He's like, didn't this help you like stay at near your home site? Like he was already giving a narrative. He was feeding him a narrative that he wanted him to say. And I don't think like that narrative was wrong. Like I don't think it's inaccurate. I just think he's like it's selectively utilized. And so like then when I talk to the guy without this Peabody representative there, he gives like a much more complex picture. He'll say, yeah, it's kept me here. I also understand its environmental problems. Like I understand that it causes these problems. And sometimes, some coal workers like feel like they recognize now that some of the bad things that happen to them, like in terms of their health, are directly related to mine work, especially black lung, obviously. Like if you're exposed to coal for a long time in that kind of labor, that's a strong, and then uranium. But these people were only working in coal, but like that, so, they'll talk about it. Part of that had to do with the people I was interviewing too, because like I said at the beginning, it was really hard to recruit people to participate in the study. So a lot of the people I ended up talking to were retired workers, people who had since retired. Stakes are a little bit different for them. Because like I think they feel like when they're actually working at the mine that if somehow it's found out they were talking to me, they might lose their job. These people are retired, so they're like, okay, let me tell you everything. Some of them were like, the union sucks. Here's why, and they're like telling me all of the problems with the union. And then other people are like, oh, I love the union. It got us these health benefits. Interesting side note, like, I wasn't able to get into it yet, but I'm going to right now in this talk. But like sometimes, like one of the things that I thought was important was to unpack the different meanings that people had when they were approaching the same political question. So you have the question of should we continue in coal or not, and you have coal workers saying yes, you have Peabody Coal saying yes, and you have tribal officials saying yes. And on the surface, you can say, oh, that all means the same thing. But when you look at their different motivations, they have very different reasons for that, obviously. I'm saying it's obvious now. But like one of the things is like to appreciate is that the Peabody Coal and the company itself had very different motivations than the workers, and they were about profit. They're profit-motivated entity, and they wanted to reduce like the amount of rights that laborers had. So when they're not talking about renewing coal, when that's already a foregone conclusion, and they're talking about like what kind of benefits do we extend to workers, they're like, we're going to continue to push against this. One of the things they wanted to do was get rid of healthcare. You know, like I imagine the workers here get health benefits from coal, right? They were like, well, you're Indians, you have Indian health services, we don't have to pay for that for you. You can get that from the federal government. So they were trying to offset those obligations of the federal government. Now, you ask any Indian person what IHS healthcare is like, it's the worst kind of health. You know, it's like really like very underfunded, very hard. You can't get it's not like you get regular doctors or anything. You just go when you have an emergency. It's like kind of the worst problems of American healthcare, like all wrapped up into one place. So like that's something that Peabody Coal was advocating against, you know, was like, we don't want to provide healthcare for these workers because they're native and they'll have other kinds of benefits. It took the UMWA, the organization, to actually push back against that and guarantee healthcare for those workers, even if it wasn't extended, it wasn't for the whole tribe, but just people who worked in the industry, which was really important because they were at more risk of developing things later on, like black lung. And so that's, you know, so I think like it's a complicated picture, like I was saying. Workers have very different kinds of interests than the industry or the company, but you know, in terms of these other kinds of groups, sorry, I went a little bit astray from your question, but in terms of the other kinds of groups, it wasn't really represented there. All right, thank you everybody for your time. I know we went over, so, or wait, I'm closing it out. I didn't mean to. You're the host. I'm used to teaching, and that's what I do when I notice that there's anxiety in the room. Yeah. Yeah. No, I can keep going. I just was feeling like I was holding people over their time. Okay.
Yeah,
okay,
there's
good.
a class at 2:30 that I will also have to go teach at some point. But I was curious. Thank you so much for your talk and your just really nuanced work on these questions. There's obviously a focus with some of the recent federal legislation on thinking about what energy communities mean and investing in those areas.
Yeah.
And you said, you know, at some point, like, why is there a focus on energy? Do we even need to be in energy anymore?
Yeah.
And if you could just say a little bit more about, like, there's obviously a poverty of imagination to focusing on energy and understanding also its economic and state power, and what you think repair or reparation might look like in this lens, whether that's through energy or not.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think like I took that from another environmental organizer at the time who's now gone into tribal law, Nikki Alex, and she was saying like, how do we make it where a solar contract doesn't just look like a coal contract? Like, because so much of the problems have been like just linked to coal itself and not thinking about the way that utilities and the reservation and tribal governments work together, or how utilities exploit their position over tribes to make tribes do what they want. In the case of the coal lease, you know, they pretty much said, we're going to continue to take X amount of water out of the Colorado River. We said, we want to get at that water. They said, if you do that, it's a deal breaker. We're going to walk away. That was one of the threats. We said, we want to extend our labor laws on our reservation to the power plant. And they said, if you do that, that's a deal breaker. We're going to walk away. This was a Salt River project, the main public utility that provides a lot of electricity for Phoenix and water. And so they were basically saying, you know, we were challenging provisions from a 1969 contract in 2013 and say we want to push against some of these things, especially around water and labor. Like we basically were saying we want Navajo hiring preference. And they said, oh, you can't do that. And you can't also ask for water. And so then we said, okay, I guess that's the only choice we have. So even despite 40 years of self-determination rhetoric and like people going to law school and learning federal Indian law and people like me like having all these like complicated critiques of things, at the end of the day we didn't have the power to change anything. And so that becomes so that asks the question, well, what is another relationship with that same utility, the same utility opened the solar field, going to look like? You know, is it going to be any different, or is it just going to be a replication of another kind of colonial situation? So that's where that question comes from. Like, why do we need to continue in energy? Will energy solve the problem, or is there a bigger problem that we need to address? I'm obviously giving you my take, which is like the bigger problem is colonialism. It's not like the kind of energy produced, but the colonial nature of our relationship with outside communities. Yeah. Or let me ask this, and then I'll come back. I don't know if I answered your question either. Sorry.
All
the time zone's really getting at me.
No, I just wanted to thank you too for your talk today. And as you were mentioning the fact that a number of your interviewees were retirees, I was also wondering if any of them mentioned the archaeology that was also occurring in the same region, focused around the Black Mesa mine and area that happened for more than 20 years. So another kind of extraction, right? So I was just curious.
Yeah, that's a good question. That is a really good question. Nobody mentioned the archaeology, but that's an important topic. There's one group called To Nejone Ane, Nicole Horseherder. If you ever look at their stuff, they have more, I think somewhere in their like webpage or their Instagram page, they have a critique of the archaeology that happened in the 60s and 70s. Basically what happened was when the leases were signed and before any kind of mining activity happened, there was a lot of archaeological survey to recover any artifacts that were there. You know, and artifacts are narrowly defined, but anything that was like a grave site or arrowhead or old house formation, not just Dene or Navajo nature, but Anasazi, because Anasazi are by federal law, but not by lineage, connected with Hopi and other tribes. So that goes back, well, this was before the Native American Gravesite Protection Act, but it was still kind of in the same vein. And it was like, okay, we need to recover all these objects before we start extracting. In fact, that's the history of archaeology, really. Like when they built Glen Canyon Dam, they were like, oh, before we flood this whole canyon, we're going to just like find everything useful and then we'll flood it. So yeah, nobody really talked about that, but that went to Illinois for some reason. Now that maybe had to do with Peabody having some relationship with Illinois. So yeah, so like a lot of those things are now at University of Illinois, I think, or maybe Southern Illinois University, one of those two Illinois universities. And there's an effort today to try to reclaim some of those objects. It's not as popular of a discourse as you think it should be in the reservation. Like it was very small and I came across it like accidentally almost. But yeah, that's an important topic. I have all the studies actually from 68, 71, all these kind of like in my office. I just haven't reviewed them, but I was like critiquing them on Instagram, and then somebody who I know who's a Navajo archaeologist, he's like, this is the foundation of Navajo archaeology. He's like, so it was like, it's an interesting kind of like, he's like, well, this would like really started out Navajo archaeology. He's like trying out new non-invasive archaeological techniques, which include like, you don't have to actually extract, but you can do like solar reading, ground, not solar, sonar. Yeah, exactly. So that's some techniques that have evolved. But anyway, yeah, so that's the status of that.
We're going to let Dr. Curley off the hook, give him a break, but I'm sure he'd be happy to hang around and ask any questions if there's still remaining questions in the audience. But join me in thanking our speaker one more time today.